How's it going, everybody? This is the Uncanny Omar from Near Mint Condition, the home of collected editions. And today I am talking to Joe Casey. How's it going, Joe?
Going good, man. How are you?
It's going well. Going well. You are all Hollywood, man. You got to be in California, right? Is this you're in LA?
That's, that's right. That's right.
Is
Hollywood,
that where
baby.
all the dreams come true? Is that where everything comes true out there?
Well, they either come true or they're dashed on the rocks. It's always one or the other.
Have you always lived in California?
No. I've lived here for about 30 years though, so I might as well have been born here.
That's a long time.
Yeah.
So really quick, you have this huge catalog of books that you've written for both the big two. You had a lot of Marvel stuff with X-Men, some stuff for Wolverine, Cable, Alpha Flight, and you have some stuff for DC Comics too, like Superman. Um, but before we started, I had to give you praise for that Image Comics, which is a creator-owned comic, the Godland book with Tom Scioli. I thought that
Yeah.
book was excellent, and
Thanks.
I have all of the hardcovers. I have all three of the hardcovers, and they're beautiful, beautiful books. Uh, but today we are talking about one of the big things that you're working on there, and that's Johnny Quest. So tell me a
Yeah.
little bit about how that got started. Johnny Quest is published by Dynamite, by the way. And big thank you to the folks at Dynamite for setting this interview up. How did that get started? Were you a fan of Johnny Quest, the show, and this was kind of brought up?
Well, I mean, the show was kind of ubiquitous when I was a kid. It was on Saturday morning, schedules for as long as I can remember.
Mm-hmm.
I'd jump around from different networks back when there were only three of them. Um, and you know, Dynamite made big news last year. They got a lot of these new licenses, these Hanna-Barbera licenses and other things
Yeah.
too. Space Ghost, Thundercats, Johnny Quest, a lot of cool stuff. And they came to me and asked if I wanted to do Johnny Quest. And I'd never considered it before. I never thought I might be a good fit for it. But when they brought it up, I remembered that in the 80s, there was a Johnny Quest comic book that was published by Kamiko.
Kamiko,
That was
yeah.
written by the great William Lobes and drawn by a host of great artists. And I really loved that book when I was a kid. And
I'm happy to hear you say the great William Messer Loves, because I also think he's great. So that's
it's
awesome.
fantastic. Yeah,
Absolutely, he is.
legend. And that was a really well received, popular book when it came out. And for me, I considered that my Johnny Quest bona fides. Is that comic book was important to me just as a comic book fan.
Mm-hmm.
And the cartoon, of course, the original cartoon has its comic book pedigree. It's created by Doug Wildey, who's a great comic book artist. Alex Toth did a lot of the design work on it. So, and it was the one cartoon, even when I was a kid, even in a world of Super Friends and Spider-Man and all that, Johnny Quest was the one cartoon that to me looked like a comic book.
Yeah,
Where
I
the
can go. I
art,
can go with that.
the
Like
art,
the classic style. Mm-hmm. I can see
yeah,
that.
the art had that detail. The characters had those proportions. They weren't, even Super Friends was sort of simplified versions of the characters you would see in the comics, you know. And that's just about the limits of animation. But with Johnny Quest, they really went for it. And to this day, that cartoon holds up quite well as a piece of visual entertainment. So
So
once I
I
remembered all the things I loved about it, I was stoked to do it.
so you grew up with the original cartoon that came out in the, I think it was like 60s, mid 60s, 64, 65, something like that.
Yeah,
And then there was, for me, I grew up with the 80s version of the cartoon. What was it? The Real Adventures of Johnny Quest, I think is what it was. And then they revamped it again in the early aughts, if I'm not mistaken. Like Cartoon Network did something with it.
yeah.
But I remember the 80s one. That's what got me hooked. I think it was it. No. The Real Adventures of Johnny Quest was the aughts. the New Adventures of Johnny Quest, that was the one in the 80s. That was the one I grew up with. And it lasted for a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I missed that show completely. I missed both reboots of that show entirely. Were just off my radar for whatever reason, and probably because, listen, when I'm a kid, I'm probably just snobby enough to be like, it's not the original. Forget about it. If I'd even heard of it, but I'd never known when I started doing research for the comic. I found out that it didn't only have one reboot, but two reboots, which kind of blew me away. But again, that is a testimony to the power of the IP, really. I mean, that it could come back and hook different generations in different iterations. I mean, that's how strong it is.
So you had read the comic book, that Kamiko comic book. How is because your book comes out in August, and who's the artist on it?
Sebastian Perez.
Okay.
He is fantastic, perfect for the book. I couldn't be more thrilled to be working with him. He's great.
And I did leave a link in the description of the video with the many different covers that you can pre-order. Because as you know, when Dynamite relaunches these series, they do all kinds of different covers. I think this one has 10. And each one drawn by different artists, right? Like you have Richard Pace and Jay Lee, and I think there's a couple of foil covers too. But Sebastian's your main artist. How did that relationship come about? How did both of you start working on this book? Was it editorial, or was it somebody you had in mind? Did you know him?
Well, I didn't know him at all. I mean, when I got the gig, one of my it wasn't a demand, but it was one of my requests, let's call it. It's to say, look, we've got to find the right artist, because if the wrong guy draws this, or the style isn't right and doesn't get me excited, then there's no point in me even doing it. Because I had a certain look that I had in mind, something that evoked the old cartoons, that evoked the Doug Wildey, Alex Toth look, but wasn't a slave to it. I didn't want to just regurgitate that look. So we were looking around, the editor and myself, and I thought of people that I knew that some people weren't available, some people weren't able to do it. And then we found Sebastian, who had been working on a book for Ahoy Comics.
Okay.
And I just was blown away, not only by his comic book work, but his Twitter feed had these sketches that he would do of different Marvel characters, DC characters, whatnot, that were fantastic. So I was like, this is the guy. He's got that style that I'm looking for. And once he did one sketch of the characters, both myself and Matt, the editor, were like, this is the guy. This is the guy. He was psyched to do it. He got into it in just the right way. Just like I said, he wants to pay respect to the old cartoon, but he's doing his own thing. So it's turned out great. I mean, I love working with him.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about the comic book, and then we can talk a little bit about your history in comics and your world of comics, and not just Johnny Quest, but everything else that inspired you. Tell me a little bit about the comic. Is this a mini series? Is it an ongoing series? How does this work with the...
I mean, listen, we all wanted things to go on forever, so sales will ultimately be the deciding factor there. I think it's going to go for a while. I'm about to start on the second story arc.
Oh, nice.
So we'll get that far at least. I would say the thing that sort of makes this interesting for me, the comic from the 80s, the Kamiko version of Johnny Quest, was very, like I said, well done, a great comic, very true to the characters. But one thing, Bill Loebs did was set it in the 80s, make it a modern story. I decided that what I wanted to do was set it in its time period that it was created. So it starts in 1964. And the story that came out in the Free Comic Book Day issue back in May starts in 1964. Now, I don't. I think it's a little bit of a spoiler, but it doesn't stay in 1964. Let's just put it that way.
Okay.
Because one thing about Johnny Quest, it's kind of they go all over the place, not only all over the world, but in the case of our story, our initial story arc, there's there's a bit of time displacement that takes place. So one of my main goals of the first story is to take these characters from the 60s and put them in a setting that would be unfamiliar to them, where their 1960s-ness would clash with the culture that they found themselves in. So that's been fun to write. I don't want to give too much more away than that. You can kind of infer where it's going from there. And a lot of people have sort of guessed already. Issue 1 lays it out right away. It's not a big secret once the first issue comes out what the conceit of the first story arc is. But I wanted to take these classic 1960s characters and their dynamic and place them in a setting that was unfamiliar to them, and see what would happen. Watch the dynamics play out. So it's been in that respect, it's been a lot of fun. And I don't think it's a story that's been told with these characters before. And there's been a lot of Johnny Quest stories told, but I don't think like this one.
Well, finding out that there were a couple of other reboots of the show, I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but I'm just curious because we've had so many stories with multiverses, and including Uncle Scrooge recently.
Sure.
Did the thought ever occur to you, like, oh, maybe I should cross these characters over and there can be a multiverse of Johnny Quest?
I mean, it hasn't occurred to me yet. But you got to be careful with that kind of stuff, because I feel like unless you're really, you're really trying to say something in the story, getting into that whole parallel universe, doppelgangers mess, it's tricky, because I'm really interested in the characters in their original form and exploring those characters and their dynamics and how they bounce off each other and how they play off each other. And even though we do a version of that idea in the first story arc, and not quite in a multiversal sense, but in a sense of seeing these characters in different incarnations. But the multiverse thing, it's weird. It's weird because I sort of go with my gut on this. I don't know how many people do remember all those two reboots. I certainly didn't know about them, and I have my ear to the ground. I'm in the animation business, and I had no idea.
Well, so, I know Venture Brothers, right? Like Venture Brothers was regarded as sort of a Johnny Quest reboot.
Oh, 100%. 100%. I think, having done my research now, I'd have to say that was probably the best reboot.
Really, the best reboot. Okay.
It's not a knock on the other versions. It's just it brought something new to the party. It's obviously not a note for note reboot, obviously, but you can see the DNA quite clearly. And I think, to me, that's the best. That's the best kind of recast of an idea. Is to you're bringing something new to the table and using the best of the old material, which is kind of what the Venture Brothers is.
Okay. Well, I think you've teased enough of the Johnny Quest show. The first comic. That's really cool. I love that you have. I love when a writer comes into something and they actually have a little bit of a history with the project, especially with, like you mentioned, with Dynamite acquiring all these IPs from cartoons or comics that haven't been around for a while. I think it adds something to everybody that I've interviewed so far. Is like, oh my gosh, I grew up with Darkwing Duck, or I love Powerpuff Girls, and I think it does add a little extra something special to the story once it's finally coming out. But let's talk about let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning, Joe, because I got to ask you a question that I'm sure you've answered all the time. you came into comics when I was leaving comics for a while. You started writing comics when I was taking my hiatus, my break from comics. That I was too
Right.
good for comic books at that time. I was going into college. I don't need this kid stuff anymore. Brother, you took over the Incredible Hulk after Peter David's 10-year run, right?
Yeah.
And your name back then, because I was looking back, I was looking at the history of Joe Casey, wasn't the Joe Casey as now, right? It wasn't huge. It was kind of like one of your earliest things. How was that? How was that experience for you? Taking over a run like that after so many years, and then having to tell your story.
Well, it's interesting because it's happened to me a couple of times where, Peter David was on the Hulk since I was a kid, so it was one of those things where he'd written it so long and so consistently, and really had a lot of high points over the course of his tenure, a lot of high points. That once I broke in as a professional, that was never seemed to be a gig that would ever be on the table. You just figure, well, Peter David's going to be writing that till the end of the world, right? So when it came up as a gig, it was very much out of the blue, and I'm not quite sure what the circumstances were of Peter leaving, but I can't imagine they were, completely peaceful. I think there was probably some drama there. I don't know, but that turnover happened pretty quick, and so I'm not sure why they came to me, except for the fact that I was new to Marvel. I was working on different things, and different editors were trying me out on different things, and I was cheap. I was hungry, and I was not intimidated by Peter's run. Good. I was professionally, respectful. Obviously, you couldn't help it. That's a landmark achievement that he did on that character. But I was still trying to make a name for myself. This was a great opportunity. I knew I was not going to be the permanent guy. So I just dove in and just did the best I could for the time I was there. What I didn't know going into it was that I would end up being the guy who wrote the last issue of the Incredible Hulk.
Oh, so you didn't know that ahead of time?
No, I didn't know they were going to stop it and relaunch it. So writing the last issue was more daunting than anything about that gig. I was like, holy shit, I'm writing the last issue of the Incredible Hulk.
Yeah.
That was insane. And so insane that I put myself in the comic moaning about writing the last issue.
I remember that. I thought that was a really cool gimmick that you did. So when did you find out, hey, we're going to relaunch it. Big John Byrne is going to come over and relaunch the book. So we need you to wrap up what you're doing. Like, how far into the story? When did you find out?
Probably, I wrote, I think 7 or 8 issues. I found out probably about halfway through.
Okay.
They just told me, okay, this is what we're going to do. And this is how many issues you've got. So think about that when you're plotting out your next story.
Mm-hmm.
So it was helpful, and I don't recall feeling rushed or anything like that. I had the space I needed to tell the story I wanted to tell. So it was not a shock at that point. Again, I'd only been in a professional for a year and a half at that point. So when you're still new and somebody goes, and somebody tells you, look, we're gonna relaunch the book with John Byrne, you go, well, yeah, I don't blame you. I guess I'd do the same thing. John Byrne's a legend, so good move there. Good move.
So it was like you were in between Peter David and John Byrne. By the way, I'm sure you know this, but just in case, because some creators don't, anytime I talk to creators, there is a Hulk omnibus by John Byrne and Joe Casey.
I know this, yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure you knew this. So That's really cool, considering how many your name is on an Incredible Hulk omnibus. There is no Bill Mantlo Incredible Hulk omnibus. There's no Bruce Jones Incredible Hulk omnibus. So I think that's really cool that they put your stories into an omnibus format to go up with Peter David's run, and of course John Byrne's beginning.
Yeah, I'm never quite sure. Sometimes omnibus releases are a little confounding as to what's the motivation for Marvel to put out, you know, collection X on month or year Y. I mean, I never understand. Sometimes I understand, and sometimes it's obvious, but that one was a weird one even to me. It's like, why are they putting this out? What's the marketing?
I love it, man. Those are we call those gap fillers. We've had Peter David run, and we've got this thing. We had the Paul Jenkins Dogs of War oversized hardcover. It came out like 10 years ago. So it's a perfect book for that era in between these stories. I love those books, man. They've done the same thing with like X-Men stories and stuff. I want to see your Cable run collected in omnibus format. I think that would be really cool.
It would just to see Ladrone's art like that is what would be cool about it.
When I was leaving comics, dead honest, man. I was leaving comics. A friend of mine was still keeping up, and he showed me the latest issue of Cable when I was in college, and I was, oh my gosh. I remember looking at it and going, man, I'm so glad I left comics. They're ripping off Jack Kirby now. And Ladrone happens to be one of my favorite artists now.
Yeah.
I love his artwork. I think he's phenomenal. And to go back and look at those stories that he did on Cable with you, it's great, man. So I'm hoping one day, because they have been collected in like classics collections. So tell me your background. You're like, we talked about Johnny Quest, but as far as like other comics, were you a fan of comics growing up?
Oh yeah, 100%. Okay. I mean, the comics were my life since I was 5-6 years old. It's just one of those things where you find something that just speaks to you and is a perfect fit for whatever your genetics are, your mentality, how your brain functions. And comics to me, I feel like is the most consistent, long-lasting relationship of my life. You know, I never went through the period that you clearly went through where you're like, I'm done with this for now or whatever. I was always into them, always wanted to do them, always wanted to make them. So to be doing it, even after God knows how many years, it's still a buzz. It's still, I never forget how badly I wanted to do it from the time I was 6 years old. That keeps me engaged. It keeps me interested. It keeps me inspired. So yeah, I go deep with comics, maybe too deep, but it's certainly.
I love to hear that, man. I love hearing that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
What were like some of your favorite comics growing up as a kid? What did you gravitate towards?
I was a big Avengers guy when I was a kid. Avengers was my book. And luckily, when I was a kid, just first getting into comics, the Avengers was going through a real good period. It was coming off Steve Englehart's run, which I would go back and get in back issues, but it was the first classic period of George Perez, John Byrne drawing, Jim Shooter writing it, David McElhinney writing it. Those comics still hold up for me to this day. So I feel really lucky that the stuff that I loved as a kid doesn't embarrass me as an adult. You know, there were other things that I was into. I was a Marvel kid when I was young, and then as I got into my teenage years, I kind of switched over to DC because first of all the Marvel guys were going to DC. And second, DC was doing all the great books. I mean, this was the years of Crisis on Infinite Earths, Dark Knight, Watchmen, Swamp Thing, Legends, the whole, DC revitalization of the mid '80s. John Byrne on Superman, all that stuff. I
Mhm.
was the perfect age for it, and that coincided with, I will say this. I mean, I never thought about um, not reading comics or not buying them, but I was really lucky in that the moment that I might have possibly thought, maybe I can move on from this because I might have been aging out of the material. That was when the independent boom of the '80s happened, with comics like Nexus and Mage and American Flag and
Oh yeah.
Concrete and all these great independent books that kept me engaged. They comics were aging as I was aging. So they kept me really right there. There was no the material was maturing as I was hopefully maturing. So I feel really lucky that that growth of the industry, that growth of the medium coincided with my coming of age. So there was never any reason the material I was reading as I got older was matching my level of material that I would be interested in at the age that I was at, if that makes any sense. I was not reading the comics that I read as a kid anymore. I was reading comics that were a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more daring in the material and the approaches, and new techniques, new formats. And I was just happy to be there experiencing all that stuff firsthand. And it really shaped my awareness and my perception of what comics could be, because they really just exploded in the 1980s in all kinds of ways. So I take that with me to this day, that experience of like seeing new formats, seeing new creator-owned characters that were not Marvel and DC, seeing upgrades in paper stock, and now of course the prices went up too, but sometimes you got to pay for quality, uh, and so yeah, that those kind of changes were happening all along the way. And by the time I broke in the '90s, I felt like I had, I was made for this job, built for this thing. And I guess I've been doing it ever since. So I guess I was right to some extent.
I have to highlight this comment because I can't remember this. Joe, remember that time you put the Homicide, Life on the Street Detectives in cable, comics royalty for that alone?
Yeah, I don't remember that either. I'm
I
not. I'm
don't
not
remember that. I was like, well, does that make cable and now all of X-Men and all of the 616 universe part of the Tommyverse?
yeah, right. Well, listen, I've done similar things over the years. Um, I don't know if you're familiar with a movie from the '90s called Gross Point Blank, a John Cusack movie,
No,
where he
yeah.
plays a hit. He plays a hitman, and there are two government agents uh, that are sort of on his tail. One played by Hank Azaria, and I put those characters in a comic. Didn't even change their character names, and had them as supporting. I don't want to say which comic because I don't want to get in trouble, but they're out there. I put the fictional president from a TV show into a comic as the president in that comic book universe. Um, so I tied those two universes together. So it's not inconceivable that I did that with the Homicide guys. I'm not recalling. That would be literally 25 years ago.
Man, that's awesome. I love when people add Easter eggs like that, right? I know Claremont was
Yeah,
really famous for adding like local newscasters into his X-Men comics. I didn't know about until much later. I lied. It
yeah.
was Jeff Loeb. So sorry. Okay. Um,
That's
um,
not a lie. It's a mistake.
I make them all the time. Mad Rocks, don't worry. All the time, brother. So here is a question from him, though. Can I ask a question about Wildcats? Because that Wildcats was another series that you went on and wrote and did your own thing. It was Wildcats 3.0. That was
Yeah.
another one that I really enjoyed too. Um, Props for taking over that series and running with it. Was there any talk of adapting your version for movies or TV shows?
Um, I'm sure there's always talk at that level, but the thing was, at that point, Wildstorm had been bought by DC. So the process of getting things adapted became much more complicated, many more levels. It became a part of the Warner
Right.
Brothers quicksand, development quicksand. So I'm sure that every property was probably looked at to some degree, but because I didn't know. Obviously, I was just it was just a work for hire gig for me, so I wouldn't have been involved in those conversations anyway. They would have happened way above my pay grade at the time.
So, uh, and I guess things did change after that too. Like because I keep forgetting that's where a lot of the stories like Sleeper by Brubaker was taking place during the Wildstorm era. So if ever
Yeah,
there was a thought of like, hey, that would make a really cool TV show, now it'd have to run through the many eyes at DC Comics because that became part of DC.
yeah. And you're in line behind Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, the Justice. At that point, you're sort of
I,
pretty far
Back
back in
then,
the queue.
yeah, right. There was like no way. Now it's like, well, we're gonna get a Stormwatch movie. That's a big deal. That's a big deal.
Well, we'll see if it happens.
Yeah, that is true. Recently read Thunderbolts Volume 1, that single issue written by Joe Casey, and when Mach 1 managed to stop a prison breakout is so well written. That might be the single issue in the entire Omnis I like the most. Now that's a hell of a compliment considering it's Fabian Nicieza and Kurt Busiek writing both of those,
Yeah, thanks for that.
majority of those.
Yeah.
But your issue stands out, Joe.
Well, I think the Leo Manco art helped. That was pretty different for that series after 2 years of Mark Bagley to have Manco's real European style art show up was probably a shock to a lot of people's system. But I like that. I like doing that.
So it wasn't the first time you worked with because you had worked with Ledron, right? And then on Wildcats, you worked with, it's like, do you get to pick the artist or is it just happenstance that this
Well,
comes?
it depends. Now I get to pick the artist most of the time.
Okay.
Back then, no, but but that's okay. I mean, I would say 70% of the time, it usually worked out. I mean, Ladrone was there before me when I got the cable gigs. I was thrilled to work with him, um, and Dustin McGuinn on Wildcats 3.0. He was brought in by Wildstorm Editorial. I didn't know Dustin or his work, and it just turned out to be a great collaboration, and we're friends to this day. So I'm never opposed to an editor going, "How about this guy? Or how about this artist?" Because it's worked out quite a bit in the past. If I have an objection or I really feel like it's the wrong choice, I'll say so. And more often than not now, even with work for hire gigs, I will be very much involved in an artist choice or any collaborator choice at that point.
All right, Joe. I've asked you easy questions so far. Here comes the big one.
All right.
No, this is simple, man. Uncanny X-Men. When you got that gig, they were going through a lot of changes at the editorial. I mean, they were like canceling titles and they were like, okay, we're going to focus on the main titles of Uncanny. You had Grant Morrison on New X-Men. And then there was Uncanny, which is where you came in with Poptopia. I think I was the first starter. All right. So tell me a little bit about behind the scenes about that. How did that come about? How did Joe Casey's name get thrown into the mix of creators?
That's a good question. To this day, I don't know if I have a good answer.
Okay.
I was certainly not the first choice. And I think that Grant had the gig first, and it was about who's going to write the companion book to Grant's book. Now that's it's not a poison chalice, but it's a thankless task because Grant's book was going to be the monster book, and everybody knew that. I knew that. Um, I think they. I think I just had the enthusiasm to do it. I think I wasn't. It's like again, like we were saying about the following Peter David. I was still new enough that I was not again intimidated. Grant and I were friends at the time, so uh, I was excited to work on the other book, to work with Grant, even though we didn't really work together. Um, I often joke that I took that gig. Half of the reason was so I could read Grant's scripts before anybody else.
Okay, that's what I was about to ask. How did that work? Because there were so many changes going on with with the characters themselves. So was it an editor that was like, okay, these characters are off the table. Have fun with Chamber. Like, how did that work?
No, I mean, Grant had picked his cast, and I, for the most part, was able to pick mine. And Claremont was doing a book called Extreme X-Men also, and he was able to pick
Yep.
his cast. And there was no conflicts between the books in terms of somebody saying, I want that character, you can't have that character. I was, again, I was perfectly willing and happy to acquiesce to both Grant and Claremont and look at who was left over, so to speak, and take from there. Um, but I will say this also, which probably modern creators, this will make their heads spin around. We had so much freedom on those books. We had all the rope that we needed to hang ourselves with, me in particular. It was not, this was an era of comics in general that was very writer driven. Whereas now I think at the big two, especially at Marvel and DC, they're very editorially driven. And writers are brought in to execute the vision of the editors that are in charge of those books. But back in 2000, 2001, it was Marvel asking Grant and I what we wanted to do with the X-Men. And then we did it. And that went from character choice to logo design to graphic design of the comics themselves. Every bit of those books were steered by us, which I don't think it probably hasn't happened like that since. I meant maybe when Hickman did the House of X Powers of 10, I think that was the anomaly where they let a creator steer the ship. But other than that, it had been Grant and I, and Grant's run proved to be a landmark run. Mine, not so much, which I fully accept, and any fault of that run not connecting with the reader was my fault. If I had to do it over again, I would probably do it very differently. But at the time, it was a game changer for me in my career because it was the top franchise in the industry. So I would have been stupid to turn that gig down when it was offered to me. So I made the most of it. I made the best of it, and I learned a lot of lessons on that book. I've said many times, and I'm not the only one who said this, that you learn from failure as much as you learn from success.
Yeah. No,
And
that is so true. But I mean, the thing with X-Men, as you probably already know, is that you're never going to make everybody happy. Even Morrison's run on X-Men is despised by people. Not everybody, right? Some people hate it. Joss Whedon's run. Claremont's return to X-Men. Very controversial, very divisive. So X-Men is just one of those titles that no matter what, you can't make everybody happy.
No, and they were divisive then. And yeah, you're right. I mean, they went after us. I would expect them to come after me. They went after Grant hard too, which was surprising because I was such a big fan of his work.
It's anything. It's like, how dare you change the beast into like a cat? Why would Emma Frost be hanging out with the good guys? What's going on with it doesn't matter what it is. Fans, I think, when it comes to characters, at the end of the day, I think we always joke about X-Men. Fans just want the X-Men hanging out at the X-Mansion and playing baseball while finding Sentinels. And then whenever a writer comes in and tries to do something different, it really, really, bothers people. And this is Nick. Thank you, Nick. Jumping in real quick. Thank you to Omar for doing an interview, and thank you to Joe for killing it on Johnny Quest.
Nick Barucci, ladies and gentlemen.
Nick is good people. Love Joe Casey's Wildcats. It's every bit as good, if not better, than Alan Moore's Wildcats. I still need to read James Robinson's run. That is one hell of a compliment right there from my buddy Spotlock. Recently bought the James. Art looks fantastic. Maybe one day we get an automatic Kafka collection.
From your mouth to DC's ear. It's all up to them. But thank you for the compliment. I appreciate that.
When you're taking over runs like that, you mentioned like with Peter David's run on The Incredible Hulk, you had read it as a kid, and then you went on took over the book. When it comes to books like Cable and Wildcats, had you when taking over those runs, do you go back and read the previous runs, or were you already reading them because comics are life, right? Like you were just fan.
I'd read both James and Alan Moore's run on Wildcats previous. I'd read them just as a fan. Those runs happened right just as I was breaking in, so I was right there, and in fact, those two guys writing that book to me legitimized that book. I was never a big Wildcats guy. Even I think I bought the initial issues when it came out, as when Image Comics launched. I was buying all that stuff just to check it out. But I didn't stick with Wildcats until James Robinson came on as writer, and then I was a big fan of James. So I thought, well, now I got a reason to read this book. I want to see what James is going to do with it. And then going from him to Alan Moore was another level up of like, well, there are good characters here. This is a good concept. Look what these legendary, fantastic writers are doing with it. So when a few years later, the discussion came up of whether or not I would want to write it or not, those guys having written it made me want to write it.
Now that's really cool. That's a really cool way of looking at it. Like finding something that you enjoyed and then having the opportunity to write the characters. I wondered, does it ever, like, when you're writing characters that somebody else had worked on, do you try to recapture the magic? Because I think everything I've read by you, whether it's Cable or Wildcats, or just recently I reread your Hulk run because the omnibus came out, it really felt like you were doing your own thing. Okay, I have to do something different with Hulk. Outside of course, I don't want to spoil what happens at the end of Peter David's run, but outside of the few elements that you have to talk about, you were doing your own thing with the character. Is that just the way that you like doing things? Because I feel like I've interviewed people like Ron Mars. Ron Mars talked about how much he loved like Walter Simonson's run on Thor and how much he loved Roy Thomas's run on Thor, which was a mistake, unfortunately, for him, because he felt like he was just doing Walter Simonson's run on Thor when he took over the book.
Yeah.
So do you feel like you have to be different?
Well, I feel like new creative energy on a book is when there's a changeover, you need to amp up the energy and get people excited. And doing the same old thing is usually not the way to do that. So, usually I feel like I try to do my own thing, even though I might be taking from other influences or other inspirations.
Mm-hmm.
Like that Hulk run, once I got the gig and had my little run of stories, I went back. My last 3 issues of that run were in a sense a sequel to a story that they told probably in the late '60s when and I had read these stories in like this weird Hulk trade paperback, this mass market trade paperback they had put out in the late '70s that was meant to tie into the TV show. Was really just um, a reprint of several different stories from the '60s. Some early Kirby stuff, some Gil Kane stuff, some Steve Ditko stuff. And I'd read that as a kid, and so when I got to do the Hulk, I went back to those stories and said, "Oh, I'm going to do a sequel to this story from Tales of Suspense that was that affected me as a kid, and I remember seeing and reading countless times as a kid." So, in a sense, when I take on a character that has history, I usually look at that history and try to tap into something that happened maybe a longer ago than just the previous run. Um, I guess it's been a while since I've taken over a comic. I mean, there's no long runs anymore in the last 10 or 15 years, it seems. But I usually will go back to stuff that I read as a kid and try to remember, well, when I read as a kid, what got me excited? Can I bring some of that to what I'm doing now? And so it depends on the character, depends on what I saw of that character as a kid. But yeah, you never want to just repeat what the readers just saw. I mean, what was the point of getting a new writer at that point? You just kept the old one.
I've seen that happen before in comics, and sometimes it's like I think it might be an editorial push. Like, look, we have to keep the tone and the themes the same. So this leads to a really good question. What are the advantages or disadvantages of having the industry moving from writer driven to editorial driven?
Well, I don't know if there's any advantages.
Okay.
I mean, to answer that part of this question, these things happen as reactions to other things. What happened in the early '90s was the artist-driven era, which that's where Image Comics came from, where art was the motivating factor of like what sold and what readers got excited about, what collectors got excited about. And the writer-driven era of comics in the late '90s and the early aughts was a reaction to that. The pendulum swung the other way. The editorial driven era that we're in now, I think, is because IP is such an important factor in all this. There's value in IP. It's very
Mhm.
corporate minded. That you want those corporate officers, which is what editors are. They're not freelancers. They work for the company. They work for the corporation. Their job is to steward these IP and make sure that they remain true to what the IP is supposed to be, that they are reflecting the needs of the company and the corporation. So I get it, why it happens. What you lose is that those occasional lightning strikes of like a Frank Miller on Batman or an Alan Moore on Swamp Thing, where the reimagination that can only come from a creator. It never ever comes from editorial. No editor would have ever thought of Dark Knight. No editor would have ever thought of what Alan did on Swamp Thing. No editor would have thought of what Grant Morrison did on Animal Man or the Doom Patrol. That had to, those takes had to come from creators and the mind of a creator. So that's what you miss out on in the era that we're in now. It's much more like an editor has an idea, he finds a creator who can execute that idea. There's very rarely that lightning strike out of the blue of a wild take on a character out of left field that, in the case of Frank Miller on Batman, revitalized not only Batman but DC Comics in general. I don't think
Yeah.
even going back further when Marv Wolfman and George Perez did the New Teen Titans, that came from them. That wasn't DC Comics going, we want to revive the Teen Titans. In fact, they tried to talk him out of it. But
Oh,
Marv
that's
or
right.
George
Yeah.
had this vision. They pushed it through, and quite frankly, it saved the company. So it's creators and creator ideas that usually have these kind of impacts. Editorial driven stuff keeps the trains running on time, keeps the companies uh, in play. But personally, for me, I do miss that, you know, uh, earthquake that can happen when a creator comes on to a character that maybe has been around for a long time, maybe he's a little stagnant, and just turn things upside down. People get excited, and just great things happen when that happens to the whole industry.
So let's let's kind of bring it back to Johnny Quest then, because when you're talking about this, Barry Windsor Smith's created book stories and then showed Marvel in the mid to late 80s. Absolutely. And Nick is right, because that's how we ended up finally, decades later, we got the monster books.
Yeah, love that
Decades.
book.
Decades. Oh, dude, it was one of my favorite reads.
Yeah.
It's so good. Oh, Life, Death, and Weapon X. Oh, Nick, you're speaking my language, man. Those are some of the greatest X-Men stories. So when working with the character of Johnny Quest, you have the TV show, right? And you've got the comics. So how is that, like, how do you feel about that relationship with your editor working, since we had just talked about the editor driven and then writer driven, like how do you feel about this relationship now working on a character like Johnny Quest?
Well, as you can see, Nick gets it. He understands what creators can bring to the table. And I've worked with Nick and with Dynamite before on things where the conversation from the get was them asking me, "What's your take on this? What could you do with this?" And they've always been receptive to what I wanted to do. And it's
Hmm.
with Dynamite, it's been more of a partnership. And one of the first things I did, because there's also the licensee, you got to clear things with Warner Brothers in this case on what you can and can't do. So that was the first thing I asked was, what can't I do with Johnny Quest? I had some things like, simple things like, can Johnny fire a gun? And the answer came back, no, Johnny's a kid. He cannot fire a gun. Okay. So um, it's not like I, was going in to tear things down or to be so radical that it would be uncontrollable.
Okay.
It's a partnership, and they've been really good about letting me tell the story that I wanted to tell. But I've also been responsible in making sure with them that I'm not exceeding the parameters that they have to abide by being a licensed property. Because listen, I've been around a while. I know what it's about when you're dealing with things that not only you don't own, but in the case of a licensed property, you have someone else to answer to as well. So I mean, for instance, we
Right.
just had to make an art correction in the first issue, which is about to come out, that because the licensee pointed something out that we just missed. So
Hmm.
we go back and we fix it. But that's all part of the process. Those situations don't change or alter the creative passion that we have. That's just housekeeping basically, and then it comes with the dinner. It's fun.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it. You brought you brought back a lot of memories of the cartoon, and then much. Okay. So we know the key players. I mean, I've seen the covers, man. We know it's
Yeah.
going to be Johnny Quest, right? We know it's going to be Dr. Ben Quest. We know it's going to be Race Bannon, and we know it's going to be Haji. But what about
Don't forget
villains?
Bandit. Don't
Well,
never
yeah,
forget
Bandon.
Bandit.
I forgot about Bandon. My bad. What about the villains? Can you give us like any little teaser or hints? Like, are we gonna see some classic villains like the Lizardmen?
We will see probably. I mean, anybody who knows the original show could probably name the main arch nemesis of Johnny Quest.
Hmm.
Uh, so he will. He is definitely in our book. You know, I mean,
Oh,
there's a lot. It's a lot of there's Easter eggs, but there's also there's a mythology of Johnny Quest that goes beyond the family. Um, and so if you're a fan of the show and fan of the Johnny Quest mythology, then you're going to recognize a lot of things, and you're not going to be disappointed by the ancillary characters that show up in the series.
Gillen's Peter Cannon Thunderbolts. That I love that book. Was a fantastic Dynamite book. It was better than any of the official Watchmen prequels. I agree with that. Looking forward to Joe's take on Johnny Quest. As am I, Joe. I'm really looking. You have hyped the book up, and I've enjoyed talking to you, man. Just talking about your career and your love of comics. It really comes through whenever you're talking about the things of the past and the stories that inspired you. So I just want to thank you, and I want to thank Vincent and Nick over at Dynamite for putting this together. And August 10th, is that the date when the book comes out? I've
14th,
left the link in the description. 14th, thank you. I've left the link in the description of the video where you can check out the different covers, where you can buy it. And they do have a lot of different covers. So get your favorite one by your favorite artist. Outside of Johnny Quest, what else is Joe Casey working on before we wrap up? Where can people find your work?
There's still some issues of Kneel Before Zod that are coming out. I think one more issue for the series I wrote for DC this year. I'm doing a book at Image Comics called Blood Squad 7, which is a superhero title that ties into the old shared Image universe that started in the 90s. But this takes place in the present day, but it involves a team that if you know anything about the Image shared universe, you know that, or Image Comics in general, you know that Youngblood was a very significant part of the early Image universe.
Which you worked on some of that.
I did, yeah. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, due to legal issues that are really, in my opinion, very tragic, Youngblood is not really a part of the Image shared universe anymore. So we came up with a team that fills that Youngblood size hole in the continuity. Okay. And the new series tracks that team in the present day, but there's a lot of cool flashbacks to early Image comics. There's a Savage Dragon flashback in issue number 2 that just came out.
What is it called?
It's called Blood Squad 7.
That's awesome. I love the name. Okay.
Blood Squad. It's turned out really good. Yeah. 2 issues out already. Issue 3 comes out in the next couple of weeks. Run out and buy it.
And
anyone who liked what I did on Wildcats, it's kind of in that vein. It's sort of a process story about how to build a superhero team in the modern day. There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff, government stuff, and along with the superhero Kicksplode that's there as well. It's a really cool series.
Awesome. Man, we didn't even talk about your co-creation of America Chavez. It's been in movies now. We didn't even talk about that. Yeah. Well, we'll save that for another time then, Joe. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Smash that like button on the way out. Check out Johnny Quest coming out August 14th. And check out Joe's other works like
Blood Squad 7, baby.
That sounds awesome, man. I'm a collected editions guy, so I have to wait for the trade to come out. But it's the whole Youngblood thing broke my heart when I found out what happened to Rob's creations and where it's at now. But who knows? One day. That's it, everybody. Have a great day. I will see you a little bit later. And